After Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to the region of Taiwan, the relationship between US and America at this moment is getting much tougher and stranger. Meanwhile, people are asking the question, where are the two countries heading in terms of these bilateral relations, economically speaking and politically? But on the other hand, people notice that the country of Japan is also under major economic and political threat from China. And given the condition that Japan has been one of the very outspoken countries regarding the region of Taiwan. Now, how should we see the role of Japan today, and why do you think it's so important that we need to bring Japan into the conversation when we are talking about this deadlock between US and China? Now, joining our show today is Kim Moriyasu, and Kim Moriyasu is an international correspondent, and he traveled extensively internationally regarding many critical and famous stories across the continent. Now, Kim, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will.
No problem, sir. The pleasure is all mine. Again, as I mentioned before in the intro, let's get to the questions. After Nancy Pelosi's visit to the region of Taiwan, of course, that caused the major political firestorm for mainland China. Now, I know you wrote numerous articles regarding this visit. Now, my first question is very simple, Ken. Do you think, from your perspective, that Pelosi, during the trip to Taiwan, she got what she wanted in the end?
Well, she got what she wanted. She wanted to make a point that America would not be, America's actions would not be influenced by what mainland China wants. So that's what she wanted to prove. Whether that was in line with the Biden administration, that's a different topic. But it was certainly a very interesting trip. Not just the Taiwan part, but also the fact that the South Korean president didn't meet Pelosi. That was very interesting too.
Well, that's right, because, again, as you mentioned, for Pelosi's visit to numerous countries this time, not only he made a brief visit to Taiwan, but also he encountered the Japanese current prime minister, but even though the South Korean president did not show up. Now, right now, we're still speculating that if Nancy Pelosi's, that she had a real or genuine interest in developing much better relationship on behalf of the US government with some of the critical or strategic partners in Asia. So help us to understand how significant was her trip this time, encountering Japan's prime minister and also the higher officials or representative from South Korea. And so in other words, why do you think it's so crucial that for her to embark on this journey? And keep in mind that Joe Biden also visited Asia not too long ago, and also the current Secretary of the State, Tony Blinken, and also wrap up his trip in Asia, and he's in Africa today. Help us understand, Ken.
Well, regardless of what Nancy Pelosi's original intent was for the visit, I think we learned so many things from this visit. First of all, let's talk about the landing of Pelosi's plane into Taiwan. I think it was watched by about 2 million people over the whole course of the 7-hour trip. At the moment of landing in Taipei, 800,000 people were watching the website Flight Radar 24, following her plane as it landed. And the moment that it was landing, it was broadcast live on YouTube on various channels. So I hear that in China, when the plane landed without any incident, there was a collective groan or expression of frustration because there was so much expectation that the Chinese would be able to block the landing in some way. Many people believe that with the advanced Chinese jet fighters, they could prevent the landing and maybe force Pelosi's military plane to go to South Korea or Japan instead. That didn't happen. That kind of tells us a lot of things. First, Xi Jinping's response to the Pelosi landing was very restrained. He didn't want to escalate at this moment. It could be that the Chinese thought that the Chinese weren't ready for war. It could have been that Xi Jinping's intention is to win without fighting. He doesn't really want to fight because there's so much to lose. So that tells us something. The mismatch between the expectation of the Chinese public and the actual actions of the Chinese government, I think that might have been a PR management issue on the part of the Xi Jinping administration. But really, that's not the important part. The important part is that we kind of saw what China's strategy was. But also, that's not to say that China won't be ready in 6 months or next year or 2 years from now. I think the thinking in the Xi administration is that once China's military is on par with the Americans, or in some ways ahead of the Americans, then they believe that the Americans will take a more compromising attitude on Taiwan. So rather than use this occasion of the Pelosi visit to really escalate into a battle, I think this told us that the Chinese are thinking that it's a long run, the competition is over a long run, and eventually there will come a day when the Chinese are more superior militarily, and that's the timing when the Taiwan issue will be solved from their perspective. So I thought that was interesting. Going back to the fact that the South Korean president didn't meet Pelosi, that was very interesting because Pelosi brings nothing, really nothing, to the table when it comes to foreign policy. And Yoon Suk-yeol understood that, and he used this. He was in Seoul. He was on a staycation. He could have met her. He used this to as a tool to strengthen ties with China, not strengthen ties, but curry a favor to China, so that it could use it as leverage. He didn't really have to pay. It was a very low-cost, high-return move, which I thought was very strategic. That tells us what is really important for South Korea foreign policy. Their number one foreign policy is North Korea, and to manage North Korea, China is not a rival. China is a partner that South Korea needs to use in order to face the behavior of North Korea. So that tells us where South Korea is, and that kind of shows us the limits of the Biden administration's strategy to kind of unite all the allies and paint it as the good guys versus the bad guys, and hope that somehow South Korea is on the West side confronting China. That's really not exactly how the South Koreans see their foreign policy. I think this Pelosi visit told us about that. It also told us about how different Japan's stance is from South Korea, in that Japan is completely aligned with the Biden administration when it comes to China, Taiwan. So it laid out where everybody stands at this moment.
You know, Kin, I think during the explanation that you brought up so many significant points, but again, I read your previous articles on the Japanese government and regarding this bilateral or strategic relationship between Japan and the US at this moment, and I want to dive into a little bit deeper. The number one, that the relationship between Japan and US actually constitute in multiple levels. You know, again, not too long ago that I talked to another international expert, and both we know that Japan and US are in this what we call quadrilateral relationship. So it's an Indo-Pacific strategic group that constitutes 4 major countries. And also, meanwhile, that during Joe Biden's presidential Asia trip, that he also stopped in Japan and he countered and, you know, he sat down with the current prime minister to exchange so much regarding how those two countries can work together. But one question I have to ask, that again, this is something that everyone is quite concerning. Regarding the region of Taiwan, why is it that Japan's so much on board with the US? So in other words, China has been saying that one China policy, this is our domestic affair, not international crisis or not international topic. But meanwhile, Japan and US are again sitting the same line to believe that if China decides to take over Taiwan militarily by force or again any other threatening moves, that not only that impact the relationship between Taiwan and US, but also Japan can get involved as well. So again, going back to my question is, why is it so concerning for Japanese government to guard the region of Taiwan? What is the Japanese government thinking or planning in return by helping US to guard this region?
Well, it's very simple. Japan no longer trusts the Chinese leadership. Especially after what happened in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was promised 50 years of autonomy. It didn't last half of that. So when the whole premise of the One China policy is that both sides of this Taiwan Strait will maintain the status quo. I don't think Japan believes that China is committed to that. So they are making preparations for the day that line is broken, because in Hong Kong, China broke its promise, clearly. And I think the Japanese believe that the logic that the Chinese used to explain what happened in Hong Kong is that that agreement that China was signed with the UK back then was when China was weak. China is big now, China is strong, so we are not bound by something we promised when we were weak. So if that's the logic, because China is big, China is strong, China is allowed to do what it wants, and smaller countries, including Japan, have to listen to what China says. So in that logic, once China decides to take Taiwan by force, if that happens on Tuesday, on Wednesday they're coming to the Senkaku Islands, and on Thursday they're coming to the Okinawa Islands, and there will be no stop. So that's the Japanese mentality, I think.
And Ken, what about this current military exercise around Taiwan? Again, we have seen China or the Chinese government implemented military strategies or military exercises around the region. But meanwhile, that Chinese government sent no direct message to Taiwan to say, hey, listen, Nancy Pelosi was here, so you better watch your next move. But meanwhile, we know that Chinese government has been very sneaky, has been very, very good at indirect communication. So in other words, when everyone is watching this whole ongoing military exercise around the region or on the island, what message do you think the government is sending to Taiwan? And also, meanwhile, keep in mind, 24 hours after Nancy Pelosi's visit, Taiwan made a public proclamation to I guess, a message clear to mainland China to say, we're not here to create troubles and we're not here to make enemies. We're actually trying to live in harmony or trying to maintain this peaceful status with the rest of the world. But meanwhile, China has no reaction to this speech or have no reaction to this proclamation at all. So again, going back to the question is, how should we understand this ongoing military exercise around this region, and what goal do you think China is trying to accomplish by implementing the current or intensive military exercising on the ocean and also on the land?
I think China's response this time was very interesting in that it was initially very restrained. It didn't do anything to Pelosi's plane. They did announce immediately after she landed that there would be massive drills surrounding Taiwan, but this would only happen after Pelosi left the island of Taiwan. So that was very interesting. Yes, there are new elements to the drills. For instance, the ballistic missiles flying over Taiwan itself, 5 of the missiles landing in Japan's exclusive economic zone, EEZ. Those were new. But at the same time, if you compare the response to Japan nationalizing the Senkaku Islands in 2012, I was in Beijing back then, the massive protests that took place in Beijing and all around China, the Japanese embassy in Beijing was new back then, but so many people walked by it and threw eggs and threw bottles. It was very intense. compared to that, that is not happening around the US Embassy. So that means that although Xi Jinping's response is pressure on Taiwan, has not launched an anti-American campaign at this stage. So that's very telling as well. For China in 2012, triggering an anti-Japan campaign was not scary. For Xi Jinping to launch an anti-American campaign in 2022, that is too risky for him. So that kind of tells us the limits or the restraint in the response.
Ken, again, you mentioned a lot of great points. I know you're very busy. I got 3 more questions before letting you go. Now, let's move on to the next part. Previously, that you mentioned because the Japanese government could no longer trust the Chinese government, given these historical ties and also these historical debates. My next question is very simple. Today, we're living in the age of globalization, and Asia is clearly growing and on this unstoppable speed. But again, as we know that in order to create a much greater effect, countries, despite this political or this economic differences, you have to work together. So my next question is, how long do you think this, this trust gap between China and Japan can last? Because given this condition that we know that at the end of the year or in November, G20 summit is coming up, which is very crucial for many countries. And the current host, Indonesia, is hoping that China is going to participate and Japan is going to be there. And so many other critical leaders in Asia are going to participate in this summit. You can't work together. So in other words, you can't be isolated if you want to see this global economy move forward. So that's why going back to the question is, how do you think that those two countries or the government can work at least on this minimal level, and so that it won't interfere this global economic situation between China and Japan at this moment?
Right, but I think it's impossible to look at just the economic and business reality and the benefits that Japan might be missing out on if it continues down this path of tension with China, because Japan is in a unique position due to its constitution. It doesn't have any army, navy, air force. It relies its security 100% on the United States, on the US-Japan Security Treaty. So it is inevitably, the direction is inevitably dictated by the relationship with the United States. And if you look at the United States, especially the US military is preparing for a potential conflict with China. And that conflict will look very different from the conflicts in the past. It won't be huge bombs and huge rockets to start the war. It will probably be a silent start to the war, where both sides will try to take out each other's satellites and communication systems by electronic warfare. So it'll be a very quiet day one of the war, and the war could be over in 10 minutes if China manages to shut down all of America's GPS communication. Then the American military won't be able to connect with its ships, with its planes. The missiles won't be able to be guided. So the Pentagon is very worried that Chinese devices in American infrastructure could be used in such a scenario to aid the Chinese on day one of the war. So there is inevitably going to be a decoupling, especially in the tech sector, to remove Chinese elements from the supply chain and from the infrastructure. And because that is not going to change until America finds a communication system that doesn't rely on GPS, and they are actively researching that. But until that day, America is not going to remove sanctions on Huawei and ZTE, and there is inevitably going to be a decoupling. So Japan has to be conscious of that big trend, because although Japanese businesses do make a lot of profit in China, as long as Japan relies its security 100% on America, it cannot go a different way. The only different way that is possible is to stop relying on the Americans and have Japan's own self-defense capabilities, but that would be much, much more expensive. And that would include Japan trying to acquire nuclear weapons, which will be an uphill climb diplomatically. So any easing of tensions with China will be dependent on U.S.-China relations, and Japan will have to watch that.
When we talk about bombs and rockets, and I want to bring another country into the conversation, which is North Korea. And you mentioned previously that South Korean government clearly understands that in order to maintain this minimum peaceful level with North Korea, China plays a significant role. And also, North Korea, keep in mind, it's rather threatening at this moment, also to Japan as well. So my next question, again, it's very simple, is by damaging this relationship with China, how does that help Japan to alleviate the pressure from North Korea? So in other words, clearly China, I guess, probably has the upper hand in terms of dealing with North Korea and managing this Kim Jong-un administration in terms of stop all the missile testing or nuclear bombs, whatever the rhetoric that is. But if Japan is not on board or it's not in line with China, don't you think that create a much greater loophole for Japanese government to understand or to deal with North Korea at this moment?
No, I think North Korea, I think China is the number one concern for Japan. And if that is clear, the strategy should be to try to use North Korea to leverage against China. Because if you remember, Xi Jinping did not like Kim Jong-un. He never wanted to meet Kim Jong-un for the first few years of his administration. He only decided to meet Kim Jong-un once it was clear that Trump wanted to meet Kim Jong-un. So China couldn't allow America to meet the North Korean leader before they met them themselves. So they hurriedly invited Kim Jong-un to China and quickly arranged a meeting. So that was very telling of how much a strategic leverage North Korea could be against the Chinese. So I think if Japan's strategy is to prepare to counter China, I think the wise thing right now would be to convince Biden to try to seek diplomacy with North Korea, because I think Kim Jong-un is uncomfortable being 100% reliant on China, and I think he would much rather prefer to have more dealings with the West. And if Japan and the US could use that desire of Kim Jong-un against as leverage against China, I think it'll be very, very effective.
Ken, I want to wrap up our conversation with a simple question. Let's talk about the relationship, or as a matter of fact, the relationship between the two leaders, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden at this moment. If we look at his Joe Biden presidency from the US, I'm sure that you know that his approval rating has dropped lower than ever. And also people are questioning his mental stability and his foreign policy effectiveness as the sitting US president. And meanwhile, this nation is standing at the crossroads, not only for the midterm election, but also foreshadow this 2024 upcoming presidential election. Now, my question is very simple, is do you think, or how much do you think at this moment that China or Xi Jinping is very much interested in dealing with Joe Biden at this moment, or Xi Jinping is hoping that by the next election results, that China's relationship with the US can improve much better? So in other words, would you say that Xi Jinping is just waiting to see if Joe Biden is going to phase out until the next election results come out, or he's thinking that taking care of domestic issues right now should be the top agenda or should be the priority, rather than paying attention to what US is actually doing or trying to damaging the relationship with China at this moment?
I think for China, the number one a preference is to have a US president who is predictable. And Joe Biden is very predictable. So I think the people in Beijing are very comfortable with this current American administration. His military superiority is clear. And at this trajectory, it will catch up with Americans. And I think it's clear through the Pelosi visit that China is not willing to conduct military operations on Taiwan until that day comes. So the number one priority is to buy time. And while buying time, what's best is to have a predictable counterpart. What is most troubling for China is to have an unpredictable president like Trump, who not only implements tariffs, which are kind of a headache for China, but like I said, the North Korean diplomacy was very troubling for China because it really, it was very strategically problematic for China to have North Korea leader meet with the American leader without consulting China whatsoever. So I think that's the kind of nightmare scenario that could push China into taking action into Taiwan before it's ready. So I think that's the nightmare scenario that Beijing fears. So as long as Biden is in the White House, Biden is trying to gather allies to create a united front against China and talking about the good guys and bad guys, that is not scary for China whatsoever.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking to Ken Moriyasu, and Ken is an international correspondent, and he travels internationally, covers news specifically regarding the Asia Pacific. Now, Ken, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we'd love to have you back on the show again as we continue to follow this political and also this economic situations, not only in Japan, but also across the world. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you so much, Will.